And welcome to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup. Today is Friday, July 7th, 2023. My name is Quaranta here with my dear friends and colleagues, the one and only David Brill and Josh Klayman, for this week's recap of articles before we start and news. Before we start, my usual disclaimer. Obviously, please keep in mind nothing discussed is accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. Josh, just back off the Gulf Stream. David down in Florida. There's been a lot of news. I keep waiting for a quiet summer week, and we don't get it. But Josh, what are you seeing in the news?
So what am I not seeing in the news? I mean, we're seeing a lot about major moves of players and friends that we know into key roles. And I think one of the things, though, that's been on my mind relates to some of the Supreme Court decisions that we've seen recently that really on their face didn't have anything to do with digital assets, but that some believe, could play a big role in how the Supreme Court in the future might decide a digital asset related case. So I think that goes back to the major questions doctrine, right? And specifically, the Supreme Court's decision in the student loan case. Basically, for those, I'm sure everyone's aware, but in case you aren't, they struck down the initiative, and according to a Morningstar article, they argued that the program was significant enough in its economic impact that the executive branch could not implement it without the explicit consent from Congress. So, it's really interesting to think about arguments that are being made by many in the digital asset space about whether the SEC should really be able to regulate digital assets at all.
And, Josh, it's interesting that you say that. A lot of the article I've been reading, you are both attorneys. I am not, but we spend a lot of time talking to legal scholars in this space. Leaving aside the politics of it, there really is this sense that there's work within the courts and within Congress to rein in, and I don't want to say the administrative state, but there's this perspective from a lot of people that there's a bit of overreach, and that extends to regulators, that extends to executive branch agencies. David, are you seeing the same thing? What are your perspectives on this? And we've raised the major questions doctrine previously. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, there's this, back and forth between Congress and the SEC in particular. And it seems like every time that Congress wants to meet on digital assets, the SEC makes an announcement a day or two before that they're scheduled to meet. Remember, SBF was scheduled to testify before Congress, and then prior to that hearing, he was arrested and didn't have the opportunity to testify before Congress. So I think we're just seeing, on a bigger level, like what is the role of government? What is the role of regulation? And it looks like the Supreme Court is a place to really make a determination on, how far and wide regulation should be and from which branch of government it should come from. So it's really interesting that, you can think about the Supreme Court as weighing in on issues that, affect our little space of the world. So it's interesting how the confluence of the court system, both on the bankruptcy level, state court level, and now on the Supreme Court level, it's kind of a confluence coming together to affect the industry.
I don't want to be. Go ahead, Josh. Go ahead.
I was going to, and certainly I'm not a litigator, as you guys know. None of us are, to my knowledge. But it really, the adversarial process and the parties, David, as you say, coming together, right? And to kind of duke it out, right? Like fight it out to figure out actually where are the boundaries. I think that's intellectually interesting, important from a practical perspective. And, we'll see what happens.
And I want to be respectful of the many different opinions that are out there regarding recent Supreme Court opinions, and none of this is meant to be, a kind of political spectrum conversation. But to the point that you're both making, it's important to realize the impact that Supreme Court opinions on very broad government work, very broad outreach by both the Congress and the executive branch, impacts multiple aspects of American life. And to your point earlier, even crypto potentially. And it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time. It's funny. I want to pivot a little bit, David, because we're going to go back to bankruptcies and lawsuits and Supreme Court and all of that interesting stuff. I keep having this running joke in my own mind that we'll raise the latest price of BTC in the markets at every one of our crypto roundups. And one of my notes was, Crypto BTC hits a 13-month all-time high, and as soon as I wrote it down, it came way off the 13-month high. Josh, I know you don't look at the prices particularly. David, you and I do spend a little bit of time doing that. What are your thoughts on some of the price action? And I want to tie that into spot Bitcoin ETF, because I think we all have something to say about that stuff as well.
Sure. Well, so I think it's really interesting because you're having all of this news. You had a wave of bullish news with the ETF filings, and people were getting more bullish about, maybe we'll see a Bitcoin ETF soon. And then you have this news where, the SEC put out, there was an article saying that currently the filings aren't sufficient, and there'll be a subsequent meeting to discuss the filings. And then on top of that, you've had this issue with Binance that popped up last night, where several members of their senior management team are leaving. And so, what's really interesting, though, is I would take the view that it's been very positive that we've been able to stay around 30,000 and that we didn't see a massive drop on those two pieces of news. My sense, Ron, is that we'll probably go below 30,000 sometime either over the weekend or next week, because the options data for next Friday is pointing to 28,500 is where the options are really landing on for a closing price next week. But I think this is all bullish. I think there's some macroeconomic news that isn't bullish to the markets broadly. So if BTC can keep some of the gains, and remember it's up somewhere between 70 to 80% for the year, even a little bit of retracement isn't a bad thing.
David, it's interesting that you say that, because, and for those of you in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. Please do keep the questions coming. We will certainly address some of them that have been posted here as well. But on that real quickly, David, it's interesting because I think a lot of colleagues in the space don't pay attention to something that you and I know implicitly over many years in financial markets, which is options open interest, short interest, and its impact. So when you say something like looking at the price points for options and upcoming options expiries, they really are forward indicators of potential price action. I haven't seen volumes, though. Is that something you're tracking as well, David?
I'm looking. I mean, the volumes are improving, especially for the summer. Like if you think a normal summer would be slow. And by the way, I have to reflect that usually on a holiday week, we would have very little news, or maybe some news this afternoon that was looking to be buried,
Friday at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, right. So this week's been really fast and furious. So we are seeing a fair amount of volume, but it's something that's evolving. And again, not a lot of people in this space are using options in the US. So I think that's kind of growing over time, but it's getting bigger every week here. So it is something worth looking at.
David, thanks. Josh, go ahead. And I want to pivot to you because we've got a great question. I think I'm saying your name properly, Janine. If I'm not, I'm sorry. Josh, go ahead.
Sure. So before we get to that comment, just one thing. And no, I don't normally comment on price or investments or anything like that. But I would just say, I think if you look at something day by day, yes, there's a lot of movement and potentially volatility if you're looking within certain bands. But to David's point, if you go back just a few months ago, 30,000 was way off from where we were just not that long ago. And so I do think, it just shows the resilience of the space. And I think some of the recent announcements by players who are not even traditionally in the digital asset space, who are actually from the very traditional financial space about the future of Bitcoin and other types of digital assets, but perhaps Bitcoin in particular, I think it just shows a lot of stuff can happen, and Bitcoin just keeps on plugging.
Josh Klayman clearly reading my notes a bit forward. We're going to get to some of the TradFi folks. I want to address Janine's question and comment. Congress gave the SEC an express and very broad grant of authority to regulate securities. So I am skeptical that the major questions doctrine even applies. And that's a fair statement. But I think, Josh, tell me if you're wrong, and David, weigh in. A lot of that comment and the back and forth on that is predicated on the use of the word securities in that contrast, in that comment. Josh, how do you respond to Janine? What are your thoughts about that?
So, I think, there are many perspectives, and I think we have to see how if the court decides to look at this question, again, Ron, to your point about, are these digital assets securities? Are they always securities? At what point, if something was a security, may it no longer be a security?
Are you going to say morphing? Are you going to say morphing?
I wasn't going to say morphing, but I think that's where because these are different types of things. Even the questions, frankly, that Lewis and the DLX team have raised about whether the digital asset itself should be a security versus the investment contract wrapper, right? So again, like I also recognize that the regulator has a different view, right? That the SEC has a different view from that. And I think that's why for some of these questions, the court or Congress, I mean, one of them are going to have the last word.
David, go. I know you've got opinions on this. I need to hear it.
I'm just going to say that let's see how the courts let it play out. I think that's the best way. And look, I think that these are important issues that need to be, go through the court system, and we need some guidance from the court system, because there's just been, otherwise, it's been hard between the other branches agreeing on where we should go.
We all, the three of us, have a couple of colleagues who would say something along the lines in response to Janine's question of everything the SEC chair looks at can't possibly be a security. We could take that up at another meeting. It's a bit more complicated a conversation. But Janine, thank you for the question, and for the audience, please continue the questions, and thank you again for joining us. David, Josh, I want to pivot a little bit because I think it's important, and Josh, you alluded to it. TradFi, we've read more than a couple of articles saying Wall Street's coming for crypto, or some iteration for that. And on the wake of multiple spot Bitcoin ETF applications, including Blackrock, and if I recall, Wisdom Tree, Valkyrie, Fidelity, and some others, we're now looking at Larry Fink, the CEO of Blackrock, coming out there and saying not bad things about crypto and BTC and the potential for the technology to really revolutionize financial markets. Is that a sea change for us? I mean, or is this just more of the same, and they're kind of pitching their own solutions in this space? What do you both think? Have I stunned you both to silence?
No, not at all. I was going to give Josh a chance to jump in, but I'll jump in. Look, I think it's pragmatism. I think that most likely they see demand for an ETF. Their clients are looking to have access and have some distribution with crypto assets, and they're responding to these client requests and looking at the marketplace, and they want a piece of the action. So I think it's just the evolution of crypto and Bitcoin continuing, and Larry Fink referred to Bitcoin as digital gold, and there's enough pent-up demand that they see a market for it, and it's worthwhile to have an ETF.
The three of us have been in the space long enough to remember when someone told Peter Schiff, who I don't know directly, although I've met a couple of times, called Bitcoin digital gold. He very resoundingly said, absolutely not. But Josh, please weigh in. What are your thoughts?
So without speaking specifically to any one company, I would just say, like, as we've said on prior sessions, at some point, and I'm not saying this with respect to all digital assets, because certainly there's nuance and there are different types of digital assets, some of which are not financial products at all,
What?
But I do think that this just reflects also a blurring of the lines between TradFi and NewFi, CryptoFi, or whatever, not even necessarily DeFi, right? But just that it's all, we're just moving into the future, and that frankly, the digital asset space is something that people can't ignore. As David and you noted, Ron, there is demand, and I think people see the promise, and it's kind of gone past the point, I would like to think, where people can just dismiss it out of hand and say, nice try.
I wonder, one of the things that catches me when I do the research on these particular things, particularly in the wake of Blackrock, I wonder if the demographics have shifted enough where it could be more palatable for regulators in the US. And what I mean by that is the institutional versus retail conversation. And there is an argument to be made. David, I want to start with you on this, because you and I have been talking about this for a long time. A lot of the initial work in crypto, and you and I go back into the space almost a decade, was retail, very focused on retail individuals, started with crypto folks who are technology savvy. Now the Blackrock impetus and the impetus we're seeing for spot Bitcoin ETF, is this driven by institutions? Do you both see that perspective?
I think it's driven by both. I think it's driven by retail who want to get exposure but are not yet comfortable using the crypto infrastructure. And what I would say is, in fairness, that some of the crypto exchanges in the US are fairly easy to use. But there is a whole populace who want exposure through traditional finance. And I do think that the ETF is an elegant way individuals who want to get exposure to Bitcoin but don't want to have a Bitcoin, don't want to have a crypto wallet, don't want to go through all of that. And this is a way for them to do it in a sort of safe and in a manner that they're used to getting access to an asset. So I think it's appropriate. I think it makes sense. I think if anything, where the crypto industry's failed a little bit is with the UI is still an issue.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I'd say is that the intermediaries in crypto have just not been as stable as we had all hoped them to be, which has led to some of these bankruptcies. And I think some people are circumspect about using crypto exchanges versus traditional exchanges. And so I think that's a confluence of what's going on.
For any, for any of us who've moved off exchange to cold storage, the old saw that not your keys, not your crypto. David, to your point, the user experience for that is just awful for the vast majority of people.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of what you're using for cold storage, it's just been painful. And I constantly get calls from friends who are newer to the space, or even friends who've been in the space a long time. Like, am I doing this right? Like, and these are people who are very skilled people, and they're still
and technologically savvy people as well.
Yes.
And it's still a pain.
Yes, it's an unfortunate byproduct that I constantly hope will get better.
Yeah,
Josh, you weigh in here, Josh.
So weighing in also about notifications, which apologies, my Outlook popped up. I will have that fixed by next time. My apologies.
No worries.
But it's interesting because yes, we can look back and say like, oh yes, retail was a focus in many ways. However, at least when I think back to like 2015, before the ICO boom, things like that, my recollection was that a lot of what I was hearing had to do, frankly, with big banks, right? And smart contracts and sort of internal incubators. And I had thought, frankly, that the large financial institutions would be kind of leading the way on the technology. And at the time when we started seeing ICOs, I was surprised, that took over, and it certainly took us in a different kind of direction from where I had thought we would be. But kind of I'm not that surprised that institutions would be involved, because it was in large institutions back in the day. We're pioneering some of the, or at least promising to pioneer some of the technologies that kind of got at least me into the space.
Yeah, and that's been underreported, I think, as well, right? And I probably saw an article, and I'm probably misremembering this, so my apologies to the audience. But I think I remember reading J.P. Morgan using underlying blockchain technology for some kind of commercial paper or other contracts overseas. I want to say in Japan. But to the extent, Josh, that your point, everyone's ignoring the underlying story that blockchain technology is being used by a lot of major financial firms across the globe. I want to hit question number 2. Rick, thanks for joining us, and thank you all for being here in the audience. Can regulated, innovative blockchains coexist with CBDCs? David, this is what you get for stepping away from the camera, because that is now your question, buddy.
So let's repeat it again, Ron. Sorry, I just had to take something. So can regulated...
Rick in the audience submitted a question. Can regulated innovative blockchains coexist with CBDCs?
I mean, look, I think private blockchains will be implemented by companies in the future. And we'll see blockchains that are being used by, a small set of companies to share data that they don't want on a public blockchain. So I think at a high level, yes, I think they can coexist. I think they will coexist. It's just a question of, will CBDCs get developed enough, and will they get to the point where, a country, sorry about my dog here.
For the audience, that's our latest WSBA member in the background.
Curly
the WSBA member.
Yes, Curly is not a fan of CBDCs and the lack of privacy from CBDCs, and so he's very adamant about that.
I want to push on that a little bit. Go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
I mean, I guess my question would sorry, I keep waiting and then, kind of talking over you, Ron. Apologies. I guess after all these years, you might be.
We're very comfortable talking.
Yes. So I guess the question partly is, when you say regulated, what exactly does that
Thank
mean?
you. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so one could argue that regulated innovative blockchains are coexisting with CBDC. CBDC is in China. Curly, do you agree?
You said regulated innovative blockchains, and Curly lost his mind. I mean, to that point, Josh, when we say regulated innovative blockchains, and Rick, if you wanted to reach out, WSBA team would love to chat with you, info@wsba.co. One of the concerns I've always had, and a lot of colleagues in this space, I would suggest, is the government picking winners. And when we talk about something like a regulated blockchain, that's government and regulators picking winners. And how do we do that effectively? How does that work? I don't know the answer to that, but it'd be interesting to see how that develops.
Well, I guess the question is a regulated innovative blockchain, is that different from what we have now? Because while the regulators might not be focusing necessarily on the technology per se, I mean, they certainly are weighing in about regulation applicable to the digital assets that sort of live or are native to the blockchains.
Part of that argument becomes what is the blockchain touching? And I think one of the sensitive points for regulators is when it touches the banking system, and when it touches individual investors, and when it potentially runs afoul of investor protections. So again, Rick, a great question, because regulated blockchains really raise this question of what's the context and what's the use case? And I think that's always really, really, really critical for us to keep in mind. I want to pivot a little bit. And again, please do keep the questions coming. Josh, David, I was only in my first cup of coffee yesterday morning, and the caffeine hadn't hit. And I saw an article that alluded to the fact that 3AC, FTX, and the SEC all lined up against BlockFi. And I thought I must be misreading this. And Curly's not happy with it either.
Curly's not happy.
Or I needed a second cup of coffee. I know we're talking about the blockchain, the bankruptcy submission and proceedings. David, what were your thoughts when you read that?
Well, look, I think, you're, again, like we talked about this last week, people don't fully appreciate the nuance in these bankruptcy cases. And in particular, in the BlockFi case, you're looking at, and a lot of times in these debtor cases, the debtors want to get broad releases from management as part of a plan that gets confirmed by the bankruptcy court. And in some of the bankruptcies, that's been contested because of the actions or alleged actions of management. So in the BlockFi case, this has really particularly come up to a head where the creditors committee and BlockFi, is moving for a liquidation, is moving for the debtors not to have control of the plan process, and they want to have this investigative report they've done unsealed. And what's really interesting is that the creditors committee is saying that they've uncovered, allegations of fraud and misdoing and fraudulent conveyances. And that is one of the main reasons why they don't want the plan to be just in the debtor's hands. And then when you go take a layer down, when you look at FTX and has, potential preference claims, and there are other financial matters between BlockFi and FTX, you have all these different constituents who have all these different views on what they want from the bankruptcy. So I'm not surprised at all. Then the SEC weighing in again on releases and them being too broad, potentially too broad for management. So a lot of the things that you've seen in other bankruptcies are replaying in BlockFi. But I do think it's important, in the spirit of transparency, that if there was a report done, that the creditors of BlockFi and the public get a chance to, hear about what's been alleged and read the facts and be able to draw their own conclusions.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also goes to show just how interrelated, as people were mapping contagion back in the day, not that long ago, right? I say that with a smile, but obviously it's a serious thing. Just how interrelated many of these relationships and companies were or are, right? And I think it gets to questions about understanding counterparty risk and the like, because part of these decisions, I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer, but part of the decisions have to do with assets that could be, assets of one debtor versus assets of another debtor, depending on how things come out. And with many of these entities in their own bankruptcies, or at least a few of the entities in their own bankruptcies, I mean, the decisions of one court can have, effects clearly on the other the other bankruptcies.
Josh, it's funny as you say that. Every time I see an article about a crypto bankruptcy, and I was really stunned when I saw the commentary and the recent reporting about the BlockFi bankruptcy, the first thing that comes to mind is, what does this mean for the customers? And I think that's kind of also, and Josh or David, tell me if you disagree, that's what gets lost in the reporting as well. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And I think the problem is that the customer angle isn't the sort of juicy news that gets to the front of a headline. And I think we're all forgetting, not all of us on this, on the panel, but in general, these are customers who entrusted their assets to a platform, and in many cases need those assets for day-to-day living. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that fact, and in some of the sort of judicial back and forth and litigating strategy, I think some of that gets lost in the wash. Now, with the creditors committee and BlockFi, it looks like they very much have a view about how quickly to get their creditors' assets back, and that a liquidation or a trustee is the most effective way to do it. But it is something that I think is underreported, and it is something that, it really is going to leave a lasting effect on our industry about our intermediaries. And so I think anything as a community to hasten getting customers or assets back is a positive.
And we don't offer, and I say this at every disclaimer, and the three of us laugh about it, we don't offer investment advice or any other, accounting, investment, legal, tax. Yeah, Josh, we've heard it literally 10,000 times. But I think we could safely say to colleagues watching this and colleagues in the industry, like, don't invest in the crypto space anything that you're not prepared to lose. And I don't mean that as a judgment on crypto. I would look at it in the perspective of any risky investment, particularly if you don't fully understand it. And David, Josh, I suspect you think the same way.
Oh, I agree. I'm all about, different allocations, and sometimes you can't. There's an expression like you can't listen to your own song and just think it's the best song, because there's other songs out there and they're probably better singers than you are. So I would say just basically that, yes, I think it's important to have allocations, and I think it's important to be prudent. And just in general, I think whether it's bank accounts, securities accounts, crypto exchanges, people should always have at least two. You should always have two accounts, whatever you're dealing with, so you have some diversification. And if something were to happen, if a bank was to fail on a Friday, like we had, a few months ago, that you have access to assets in more than one place.
Josh, I was asking David about diversification the other day, and I asked about art, and he just starts rolling his eyes at me at this point. Like he doesn't want to help me in this diversification field, and I get it. But Josh, go ahead. I cut you off.
Oh no, you didn't cut me off. I mean, I think, it's important to remember, I think, that yes, there are successful companies, projects in the space, but this is a startup field, and startups fail.
That's right.
Startups fail a lot, and we're still building this industry. Holding aside things like fraud or alleged fraud or, other bad things or alleged bad things, like startups fail. And so I absolutely agree that people should be cautious and should be judicious about, relying and risking more than they can bear the loss of. I do think with respect to the other point, Ron, that you raised about customers, I think even part of it is semantic, right? Because when you say creditors, it just has a different feeling than customers, right?
Yeah.
Even though the customers are creditors, it feels like they are debt collectors or bill collectors when you say creditors, right? Whereas when you say customers, then you're like, ooh, it hits differently. So I think that's maybe one of the pieces there, even though it's just a word, the fact that we're actually using the words of the bankruptcy system, it obscures a little bit some of the personal.
And to that point, Josh, words matter. I have a friend not in financial markets, but certainly aware of crypto, got caught up in one of these, not to a great tune of money, but the perspective he gave was it feels like the customers don't count in these bankruptcy proceedings. And I honestly didn't have a good answer for that, because you're right. They are creditors, but words are important in understanding how those words impact participants in this are critical as well. I want to segue a little bit. I want to thank Rick again for another great question. And I'm going to start with David on this one. Do you think regulation is needed with centralized exchanges? I want to say this is an easy answer, David, because I know what I want to say in my head. But I want to start with you because I want to sanity check that.
I think that we need to determine what these intermediaries look like and what they are. And then after we determine that, decide what kind of regulation is appropriate. What I don't want to see is trying to change definition of exchange or change certain definitions to incorporate current legacy crypto intermediaries. And then suddenly all these sort of legacy rules apply when they may not be applicable, and when the assets, a lot of us think the assets aren't necessarily securities. So that's my sort of view of the world.
Josh, I feel you wanting to answer that as well. So I got to toss this over to you.
I mean, I guess I would go again to the question, right? Like, what kind of regulation? Existing regulation, new regulation, regulation for what? Because some things, like, I think generally many of us would like to prevent terrorist financing, right? That's a kind of regulation, and sanctions and other things. Of course, there are questions as to what regulation applies now and whether we need new legislation or whether so I think it's hard to answer that. I mean, in my view, in general, certain kinds of regulation I would like to see, even if it's anti-fraud, with respect to centralized exchanges. But I think there is a question as to what applies now in certain instances and what we think should apply.
I'm going to take Rick's question. I'm going to be slightly selfish with this, Josh and David, because I think it's a really great question. And I'm going to shamelessly plug the WSBA crypto industry principles behind this. And one of the questions that, Josh, you and David both alluded to this. There's the conversation around regulation, which everyone on this call realizes and believes investor protections are important. We agree with that. When we look at what we're trying to accomplish with the crypto industry principles, some of the things we've seen in the industry, it goes beyond whether or not a centralized exchange is regulated. It goes into, you should not commingle customer funds. You should segregate assets. You should provide for proper disclosures, for example. And as both of you know, and anyone who's in the audience is interested, WSBA.co on the front page of our website, we've got a link to our multi-page crypto industry principles, and we do a weekly understanding those principles, because you could argue that companies operating with these principles in mind could avoid some of the worst problems that we've seen, short of fraud. I mean, there are people out there, if you're going to commit fraud, you've got it coming. You're doing something illegal. You're not treating customers right. You're violating the law. Do you think the principles apply to a question like this, David or Josh?
Why don't you go first, Josh?
Yeah.
So I think the principles do, because whether or not you think we need new regulation or existing regulation, I think the principles go to the questions that you should be asking yourself, right? So not just looking to see what the requirements are. Of course, you should know what your legal and regulatory requirements are, but also I think going further and saying, okay, well, understanding where the lines are drawn, assuming you can, what do I think is a best practice? What do I think is sensible? And so I think just as you noted, Ron, like, obviously fraud is bad, all of
Everyone
those
agrees.
things. And again, you can't necessarily prevent failures of early stage companies, or even sometimes late stage companies. Things happen. But I do think understanding counterparty risk, understanding, committing to having certain baseline procedures and commitments to transparency and other things like that, I think would go a long way to promoting a more, I don't want to say safe, because,
careful with that word,
risk
John.
abounds. Exactly. Risk abounds. So just a more, I don't know what the word is, but a different place.
Go ahead, David.
A better place.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that there are some guideposts that we could share with the community and share our take and get feedback on them and see, what other people think in the industry. But there are some common sense approaches that I think lessons have been learned in the last 2 years that can be incorporated into those principles that could serve as a positive guidepost for companies in the space.
Thank you both. One of the other items I've been paying attention to, and I try not to pay attention to this every week. I don't do a particularly good job with social media per se, but I think one of the more salacious or uglier parts of the ecosystem of crypto assets is kind of social media participation by executives in the space. And I don't mean that as a judgment on them personally, but when you see these open letters from one CEO to another, I'm thinking specifically, David, you and I chatted about this earlier. I believe there was a recently launched lawsuit in state court by Gemini Exchange against DCG without weighing in on the merits of the case. I always find the kind of public argument first and lawsuit second really kind of sullies the reputation of the industry. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and not talking to the Gemini and DCG one specifically. I'm not a fan of that. I think what I would like to see is if an action is brought, that maybe after that action is brought, an explanation by, the head of one of the companies that brings that action about why they're doing it and what the purpose is. I think trying to litigate in social media is not the way to go. It sort of runs counter to good legal advice that I think people would get, broadly speaking. But, I think the one thing I will say is that you have a lot of frustrated customers who perceive that when they don't see something happening, that they perceive inaction. And some people feel that the way to show their customers that they're not just sitting on their hands is by doing these things to show them that they are doing something. So I'm not a fan of it, but I think after the fact is not a bad way to do that if you feel it's necessary to point to a filing you've made and say, look, we made this filing, we've done it for ABC reasons, and point to sections in the complaint. And I think that's a more elegant way of going about it.
Yeah, one of the things I focus on is, when you look at, I want to be fair about this too, right, David? It applies both ways. When you see these ridiculous memes about the SEC chair, that does nothing to burnish the argument of the crypto industry, but where participants are pointing out where they disagree and cite very specific things. I think that's an important part of public discourse. Josh, are you kind of on board with that? Do you agree?
Holding aside the reference to Gary Gensler, yes, I broadly agree. Yes, I do think, public discourse is important. I also think, and I agree with what David said as well. I do also think that to the extent that, we as an industry value transparency, and to the extent that someone may take the view that, certain disclosures required by securities laws may not apply because maybe securities are not involved. In certain instances, I think making public statements to the community can help with information asymmetry, right? So without going into any kind of specific ball being lobbied across or something like that, I do think that there are certain messages to the community where if you're going to try not to have material non-public information, and you're trying to say, hey, look, we are very open and we are as transparent as we can be, I do think social media and other sorts of places can play an important role.
And information asymmetry, it's a really good point, Josh, because I tend not to subscribe to the broad conspiratorial theories that it's asymmetric because someone in government's not sharing some information. But it's important to be discerning, right? When you read kind of through what you're seeing in the media, including articles, including social media. Would you agree with that as well?
I agree. I think everyone should remember that people, there are many, many great journalists, particularly in our space, but, often people may have an angle.
Yeah.
And
so many of us know all too well, Josh. I want to hit Rick's question again. Rick, thanks again, and thank you all for joining. What can move the crypto industry forward? I'm just going to say it, David, because it segues me into my last point of the day, which was David hung up as soon as I said I was segueing to David. So, Josh, now I'm going to segue to you. I think a spot Bitcoin ETF. David, I'm going to have to put you on mute, buddy. I'm really sorry. a spot Bitcoin ETF would be useful in propagating and moving the crypto industry forward. Josh, I mean, do you agree with that? I know I keep saying do you agree a lot, but what's your perspective on the importance of a spot Bitcoin ETF?
So what I would say is, to the extent that some of these well-worn issues where they've bumped up against some kind of impediment for a while, if we're able to break through and find solutions, such as having a Bitcoin ETF and get it approved, I think, yes, that can help bring the crypto industry forward. What I would say, though, is I think the crypto industry is moving forward regardless of whether we get the Bitcoin ETF. So I wouldn't want to put that as a gating item. Because you know what, if we don't get it now, we'll get it later.
Moving forward,
life is long.
moving forward because of what's going on overseas, or what's happening here in the States, or both.
I think just both. I mean, people haven't stopped working. They haven't stopped innovating. They haven't stopped thinking. And so I do think we're hearing a lot in the media and certainly in the courts and in the legislature, and around the world, not just in the U.S. in these ways. And yes, that has a lot. There's a lot going on.
Yep.
But I think the crypto industry continues to innovate every day, and builders keep building. And some of these things we'll find out the answers, the quote answers. It could take years.
Yep.
And so I think incremental steps. If we can get a Bitcoin ETF, fantastic. But if we don't right now for some reason or another, I think the crypto industry moves forward.
I agree with you. And Josh, the one thing why I put a little bit more importance to a spot Bitcoin ETF like a Blackrock ETF or a Fidelity or a Wisdom Tree is that that brings with it the entire series of customer protections and regulatory oversight that those firms are very familiar with. Those spot Bitcoin ETFs would be very different than, two kids in a basement issuing a spot Bitcoin ETF. And I would argue that it would go a long way to build trust in the industry as well. I think we've lost David, which is really sad. He's probably hitting the beach and surfing down in Florida. David, I'm really sorry about that. Josh, what do you have coming up next week as we wrap up?
Oh, gosh.
Where are you traveling to this time?
I don't think I'm traveling. I think I'm just going to be having my head down working, because there's certainly a lot going on. But I will double check. I hadn't actually looked at my calendar. But what about you?
We're going to be tracking you the way they track Elon Musk's Gulfstream on Twitter. Just
or Santa Claus.
Or Santa Claus. Actually, I have a busy week coming up. We all do here at the WSBA. On Wednesday, we're doing episode 2 of Understanding the WSBA Crypto Industry Principles. We're going to deep dive into customer rights and the principle around customer rights and principles that we think are very, very important for the industry. Josh, hopefully you can join us or at least watch. We've got Jess Stumaka, David Wysocki, and some others that were with you and I as part of that core team. That'll be Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And in between there'll be lots of news. So I'm looking forward to keeping up. Josh, great seeing you. David, I'm sorry we lost you, buddy. I'll drop you a note and we'll catch up soon. Thank you to all the audience. If you're interested in participating or learning more, drop us an email, info@wsba.co. It'd be great to chat with you all. Josh, we'll leave it there. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, you too. Take care. Bye.